Hello, you all. This is Mr. Griffith. Today we are going to talk about solving equations using this by taking the square root. This is your last day of your second week of NTI, or I guess your second set of NTI weeks, your um, ninth day of NTI total. So this is 9-4, solving quadratic equations using square roots. And so quadratic equations, you got to remember, and we've talked about it a lot, so hopefully you remember, look like this that I've written in the top left. Ax squared plus bx plus c. Some number times x squared plus another number times x plus a number. And it doesn't have to be plus, it could be minus. It could be like 7x squared minus 2x minus 7, something like that. And it doesn't matter if it's plus or minus. That's not what I mean. I just mean a number, x squared plus another number x plus a number. And what's important for quadratics is you don't have to have something for each of these as long as you have an x squared term as your highest exponent. So this could be 7x squared minus 7. This could be 7x squared plus 2x. It could just be 7x squared by itself. It could just be an x squared. All of those are quadratic equations. Today we're going to talk about solving by taking the square root, solving these kinds of equations by taking the square root. And this is useful, and that's why I've written it over here, when there is no middle term, when b is 0. So this is going to talk about equations like x squared equals a number, uh, or a number x squared equals a number, or in our last example, a number x squared plus a number equals a number. We're not talking about 3x squared plus, you're not going to see any just x's, plus 17 equals 209, because that's when it gets more complicated. That's when we'll have to use other strategies. For now, there won't be any x's. It'll just be x squared and numbers. So we'll start with the most basic example. You have x squared equals a number. So example 1a. And when you solve any equation, your goal is to get x, or your variable, by itself. And in this case, we have x raised to the second power equals 169. The square, the exponent, is what we're trying to get rid of. We don't want to say x squared anymore. We want to just say x equals. And to do that, to get it by itself, you have to take the square root. That is the opposite. Just like you subtract when you see addition, you divide when you see multiplication. When you see an exponent, you have to take a root. If you see a square, you have to take a square root. If you see a cube, you'll have to take a cube root. And we're not going to talk about that in Algebra 1 as much, but we are talking about taking square roots to solve these quadratic equations. And so when you take the square root of both sides, you're going to get uh, x by itself. And on the other side, we're not going to just write the square root of 169. I mean, that would be very easy, right? But actually, and we'll talk a little bit more why, that you have two answers. You don't just have this positive square root 169. You have positive and negative. That's what this symbol that I've just drawn means. Plus and minus, positive and negative. Square root 169. In your calculator, you find out that the square root of 169 is 13, because 13 times 13 is 169. So our answer is not just 13, it's positive 13 and negative 13. There are two answers. And we've had two answers before with quadratics. So this isn't a new idea. And for those of you who are like, well, that doesn't make sense, why? Well, remember, we're saying x, some number squared equals 169. So let's try out both of our answers. We're going to say, what happens when 13 squared? And we're going to try our other answer, negative 13 squared. And we try both of these in the calculator. 13 times 13, 13 squared, is 169. That checks out. Okay, cool. In our calculator, you do negative 13 times negative 13. A negative times a negative is also a positive. Okay, so both answers work. That's why there are plus and minus for these answers. And so please remember that when you take the square root, when you do it, not when it's already written there, but when you take the square root to solve a problem, you're going to have two answers. Okay. Now let's look at uh, example B from example 1. we have now x squared equals a negative number. And this is going to be one of our special cases because, as you might imagine, we're going to do this the same way. We take the square root to get rid of our exponent. You're going to get x equals this. And if you try to figure out what the square root of a negative number is in your calculator is going to give you an error. And it's actually not an error. You'll learn what the answer is in Algebra 2. That's when you get into imaginary numbers. But for now, since we don't want to talk about imaginary numbers, we don't want to deal with that. When you take the square root of a negative, when you see a negative under a square root, just write no real solution. There is a solution. It's not no solution. There is a solution. It's just imaginary. We're not going to deal with it in Algebra 1. So please write no real solution. No real solution. And that's going to happen every time there's a negative under the square root. You have a negative 16 under the square root. No real solution. Move on with your life. Now we're going to get slightly more complicated. Instead of just x squared equals a number, now we have a number x squared equals another number. So we have 5x squared equals 125. We got to go. I've written PEMDAS over on the left because to remind you, when you solve equations, you should do the reverse of your order of operations. So first I should look and be like, I see AS on the end of PEMDAS, so I should look for addition and subtraction. I don't see any addition and subtraction, so I'm going to move to multiplication and division, the middle part of PEMDAS. And I do see some multiplication. 5 times x squared equals 125. I see multiplication there. And how do we get rid of multiplication? We divide. So I have to divide both sides by 5 to get rid of that multiplication that's there. And I'll be left with x squared equals 125 divided by 5 is 25. So first I divided. Now this looks just like example 1. Like at this point you're like, okay, I know what to do. I take the square root to solve my quadratic equation. And I'm going to get x equals, is it just one answer? No, it's plus and minus the square root of 25. Let your calculator do the work for you. In your calculator, type out what is this, don't type out what, but type square root 25, press enter, and your calculator will tell you that the square root of 25 is 5. But remember, we're not writing just one answer. We are writing plus and minus because we took the square root to solve. When we were solving this, we took the square root, so it's positive and negative, plus and minus 5. Our fourth and final example, we're gonna not worry about A, we're gonna do B, is right here. 3x squared plus 17 equals 209. So this is the hardest it's gonna get. Remember I told you that you're not gonna want to use this strategy when there's a middle term, when there's a like 3x squared plus x plus 17. We're gonna have to use other things to solve. But right here we still don't have a middle term. We don't have an x. We just have an x squared and numbers. So we're good to go. We're gonna use this strategy. I first look for addition and subtraction. I see plus 17. So when I'm solving this kind of problem, I need to get rid of the plus 17 first, and I'm going to do that by subtracting. So minus 17 on both sides, and I'm left with 3x squared is now equal to 192. Now this problem looks exactly like example 2, right? So from here on, it's no different than example 2. So if you were confused about what I do now, you should look back at example 2. But to get rid of this 3 times x squared, I'm going to divide 3 away. I'm left with x squared equals 64 because 192 divided by 3 is 64. Now it looks just like example 1. We're in our home stretch. To get rid of the exponent, we take the square root. And I'm left with x equals plus and minus the square root of 64. In your calculator, you're like, okay, well, what is the square root of 64? Well, the square root of 64 is 8. Why did that take me so long? And so our answer is x equals positive and negative 8. And that's really all we're going to talk about today. Just those examples. If So a quick recap, you see x squared equals, you take the square root. You should have two answers, positive and negative. If you take the square root of a negative number, you can't do that. Try it in your calculator. It'll be like, nope, don't do that. Your answer is no real solution. Not no solution, no real solution. If it's got other numbers around it, just get rid of those numbers until you see it say x squared equals, and then from there, take the square root. So that's what we've done on the rest of these problems. I hope this makes it a little bit easier to understand. Remember to reach out to me or any of your other teachers if you have questions and concerns. Um, your homework depends on the teacher, so make sure you look to see what it is you need to do. Hope you all are doing well.